Hi, I'm Eleanor. I was standing at my son's stove, my hands red and pruned from washing dishes for 6 hours straight, when I heard my daughter-in-law tell her dinner guest that at least our maid was good for something. I was the maid she was talking about. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did, standing right there behind that kitchen door with the serving dish still warm in my hands, and something in me went very quiet and very still. Have you ever given everything you had to a family only to become invisible inside your own sacrifice? If this story feels familiar to you in any way, I'm glad you're here. This channel exists because women like me need somewhere to be heard, and it costs you nothing to listen. If you'd stay a moment and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, it would mean more to me than you know. Now let me tell you how I ended up in that kitchen in the first place. I raised one son, David, mostly on my own. After his father passed when David was 11, I worked 26 years at an insurance office in Ohio, filing claims, answering phones, saving every spare dollar I could into an envelope I kept taped behind a dresser drawer. Because that's how women of my generation learned to save quietly, in cash, where no one could touch it. When David grew up and married a woman named Rachel, I was happy, genuinely happy. I danced at that wedding. I told everyone who would listen that my son had found himself a smart, ambitious woman, and I believed it because it was true. Rachel worked in marketing for a regional bank. She dressed sharp, she spoke sharp, and in the beginning she was kind to me in the way people are kind when they don't need anything from you yet. 3 years ago, my hip gave me trouble. The kind of trouble that turns stairs into an enemy and grocery bags into a gamble. Around the same time, my husband had already been gone 8 years, and the house we'd built together, the one with the low door frame he used to duck under, and the kitchen window that faced the maple tree, got to be too much for me to keep up alone. David came to me himself, sat at my table, and said, "Mom, sell the house. Come live with us. We have the space. The kids would love it. I want you to notice that." He asked. Rachel didn't ask. But she smiled and nodded along, and I told myself that smile meant welcome. So I sold the house I loved for a fair price, more money than I expected, honestly, and I moved into the guest suite above their garage in a neighborhood called Prescott Hills on the edge of Columbus, the kind of neighborhood with brick mailboxes and lawns cut in stripes. I brought 2 suitcases, a cedar chest that had belonged to my mother, and that same envelope of savings, only now it lived in a small fireproof box instead of behind a drawer. I told myself I was starting a new chapter, helping raise my grandchildren, being useful in my golden years instead of rattling around alone in an empty house. I believed that too in the beginning. The first few months were sweet enough. I made breakfast for the kids, Sophie who was 7 and Tyler who was 5, before school. I picked them up some afternoons. I cooked dinner 3 or 4 nights a week because, frankly, I'm good at it and I like doing it, and nobody was making me. That distinction matters more than you'd think. There's a world of difference between choosing to help and being expected to. I didn't know yet which world I was living in. I remember those early mornings clearly. The smell of coffee and cinnamon toast. Tyler, still in his dinosaur pajamas, arguing that cereal counted as a hot breakfast if you thought about it hard enough. Sophie already dressed and lining up her stuffed animals along the windowsill in some order only she understood. I liked being needed in that particular way, the way a grandmother is supposed to be needed, a warm presence in the kitchen before the day gets loud. My own mother had done the same for me once, in a different kitchen, in a different decade. And standing at that stove those first mornings, I felt something like a thread stretching backward through my whole life, connecting me to her, to my grandmother before her. Women standing at stoves, feeding children, who would grow up and mostly forget the exact taste of it, but never quite forget the feeling. Rachel would leave for work around 7:30 most mornings, heels clicking across the hardwood, travel mug in hand, always in a hurry, and in those first months she would still pause at the door and say something like, "Thank you, Eleanor. I don't know what we'd do without you." And I would feel useful and warm and glad I'd made this choice. I want you to remember that version of her, because I need you to understand this wasn't a woman who was cruel from the very beginning. She simply, over time, stopped seeing the effort behind the ease she'd come to expect. That's a particular kind of danger, I think, the danger of comfort becoming invisible to the person receiving it. But little things started shifting, the way water shifts a stone, so slow you don't see the shape changing until one day you look down and the stone is gone. Rachel stopped saying thank you for dinner. She started saying things like, "Can you get the kids' lunches ready by 7:15 tomorrow? We have an early meeting," in a tone that wasn't a question at all. David started coming home later, tired from his job at a logistics company downtown, and instead of noticing what I'd taken on, he just accepted it as the new normal, the way you stop noticing a hum in the house until someone points it out. I want to tell you about a Tuesday, because Tuesdays became a kind of pattern for me. On a Tuesday, I would do 3 loads of laundry, mine, the kids, and somehow always a good portion of Rachel and David's too, because it was easier for me to just throw it in with what I was already washing. I would clean the kitchen twice, once after breakfast and once after dinner. I would walk Tyler to the bus stop and back, wait with Sophie for her ride to gymnastics, water the flower beds Rachel had chosen but never tended, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I would fold myself into whatever chair was empty and rest my hip for exactly as long as I dared before someone needed something again. I'm telling you this not to complain, because complaining was never something I did well, even when I probably should have. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the shape of what was happening to me before I tell you what happened at that dinner. If any part of this is landing somewhere true for you, stay with me a little longer, because it gets harder before anything gets better. And I promise you, it does get better. There used to be a woman named Carmen who came twice a week to clean the house before I moved in. 6 months after I arrived, I overheard Rachel on the phone telling a friend that they'd let Carmen go because, and I remember this exact phrase, "Eleanor's here, now. It just doesn't make sense to pay for 2 of us." 2 of us! As if I were a service they'd contracted rather than a mother who'd sold her home to help raise her grandchildren. I stood in that hallway holding a laundry basket against my hip, and I felt something crack quietly inside my chest. Not loud enough to be called a break, just a hairline fracture, the kind you don't feel again until you press on it directly. Carmen's absence meant her work simply transferred to me without a conversation, without a raise in anything except expectation. The bathrooms, the baseboards, the windows twice a year. Nobody sat me down and asked if I was willing to take all of that on. It just accumulated onto my shoulders the way snow accumulates on a roof. Silently, 1 flake at a time, until one day you're worried about the weight of it. I still remember Carmen's face the last time she came, a kind woman from Guatemala who'd worked in that neighborhood for 11 years, who always brought Sophie a little candy from the bodega near her own house, who told me quietly, almost apologetically, as she packed her supplies into her car for the last time, that she was sorry, that she'd liked working there, that Rachel had been polite about it but firm, budget reasons, nothing personal. I hugged her at the end of the driveway and told her to take care of herself, and I meant it, and some small dishonest part of me even felt a flicker of relief, thinking, well, at least I'll have more control over how things get done now. I didn't yet understand that relief was the first small lie I told myself on the road to becoming exactly what replaced her. The physical toll crept up slowly enough that I could always explain it away as something else. My knees ached most nights, but I told myself that was simply 70 years catching up with me, nothing to do with 3 hours on tile floors scrubbing grout with an old toothbrush, because Rachel liked the bathroom to look, in her words, hotel clean. My hands cracked and split at the knuckles from the cleaning chemicals, and I started keeping a tube of lotion in every room. A small, quiet ritual nobody noticed, rubbing it in while waiting for water to boil, while waiting for a load of laundry to finish. Small, stolen moments of care for a body that was being asked to do more than it reasonably could. David would come home and say, "Dinner smells amazing, Mom, thanks," and kiss my cheek, and for a moment I would feel seen. But he never once asked Rachel to help me with the dishes after. He never once suggested we hire someone back for the deep cleaning. He worked hard at his job, I'll give him that. He came home genuinely exhausted most nights. But exhaustion is not an excuse that only applies to some people in a household, and not others. I was exhausted too. I simply wasn't allowed to say so out loud, because who was I going to say it to? My son, who needed to believe his family was thriving. Rachel, who had already decided what my role was. I remember one night specifically folding a mountain of towels on the guest suite bed because there wasn't a clean surface downstairs to do it on, and catching my own reflection in the dark window glass, an old woman surrounded by other people's laundry. I didn't recognize the tiredness in that reflection. It wasn't the good tired of a full day's honest work. It was the tired of being used up and unacknowledged, and there is a particular loneliness in that. The loneliness of being essential and invisible at the exact same time. There was a moment, maybe 8 months in, when Sophie, my granddaughter, asked me while I was braiding her hair for school, "Grandma, do you get paid for taking care of us?" A child's question, innocent, curious, and I laughed it off and said, "No, sweetheart, grandmas do this because they love you," which was true. But driving that question home later that night, alone in my little suite above the garage, I realized even a 7-year-old had noticed the shape of my labor, clearly enough to wonder if it was work. Even a child could see what the adults in that house had decided not to see. I sat with that question longer than I let on to Sophie. I thought about my own grandmother who lived with my family for the last 6 years of her life. Back in a different era entirely, when 3 generations under one roof was simply how things were done, no one thought to name it any particular way. But even then, even in that older world, there had been a kind of reverence for her presence, a chair that was always hers at the table, a standing rule that her opinion on Sunday dinner was final, a sense that her presence was the point, not merely her productivity. I began to wonder, lying awake some nights listening to the house settle around me, whether that reverence had simply gone extinct somewhere between her generation and mine, replaced by a quieter, more transactional way of valuing the old, measured now only by what we could still produce with our hands. I started keeping a small notebook around that time, nothing dramatic, just a habit from my insurance years. Writing down little things I noticed, not to build a case exactly, not yet, but because writing things down had always helped me think clearly. Tuesday, 3 loads laundry. Wednesday, deep cleaned both bathrooms, no one asked. I simply knew it needed doing. I wasn't angry when I wrote those entries. I want to be honest about that. I was, if anything, trying to understand my own life better, the way you might track symptoms before a doctor's visit, trying to see a pattern that from inside the day-to-day felt too close to name clearly. If this is striking something in you, something about being needed constantly but valued rarely, I want to ask you gently to like this video or leave a comment, not for me, but because it helps this story reach another woman somewhere who might need to hear that she isn't imagining it. Somebody else notices. I notice. Let's keep going. The months rolled forward the way months do when you're too busy to track them properly. Somewhere in there, Rachel got a promotion, senior marketing director, and the household budget seemed to loosen in certain directions and tighten in others. New furniture appeared in the living room, a sectional sofa the color of wet sand that cost, I later learned by accident, nearly $4,000. A new car showed up in the driveway too, David's, a German import, sleek and silver, the kind of car that says something about a man even when he says nothing about it himself. Meanwhile, my request, gently made once about maybe hiring someone part-time to help with the heavier cleaning, was met with, "Mom, things are tight right now. We're saving for the kids' college funds." Tight, apparently, meant tight only in certain rooms of that house and not others. I noticed these things the way you notice weather changing, not with outrage yet, just with a kind of quiet cataloging. I've always been a woman who pays attention. 26 years of insurance claims teaches you to read details other people skim past. And I was reading the details of my own life now with that same careful eye. And what I was reading troubled me more each week. Then came the mini-earthquake, the first real crack in the floor beneath me. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen, and I overheard Rachel on a call with her sister, half laughing, saying, "We actually don't need to worry about hiring anyone for the party next month. Eleanor will handle the food and the cleanup. She practically runs this house for free anyway. It works out great for us. For us, not with us. For us." As though I were an appliance that had finally paid for itself. I stood very still in that kitchen holding a peeler in one hand and a potato in the other, and I let that sentence settle into me completely. She practically runs this house for free anyway. There it was, spoken plainly, not even meant maliciously in her mind probably, just spoken the way you'd mention that the dishwasher finally got fixed. Convenient, useful, free. The potato peel curled off in one long ribbon under my thumb, an old habit, an old skill, my mother teaching me at a counter, much like this one when I was maybe 9 years old, and I remember thinking in that strange sideways way your mind wanders even in painful moments, that I had been peeling potatoes in one kitchen or another for over 60 years now, and never once, not one single time, had it occurred to me to think of that labor as something owed to me until a stranger's voice on a phone call reduced 60 years of care into the word free, as though free meant worthless, as though the absence of a price tag meant the absence of value entirely. I finished the potatoes. I finished the whole meal prep for that Sunday, actually, moving through the rest of the afternoon on a kind of autopilot, my hands doing what they'd always done, while some other part of me sat very quietly in a back room of my own mind, turning that phrase over and over, examining it from every angle the way you'd examine a stone you'd found and weren't yet sure was valuable or just oddly shaped. Rachel came downstairs an hour later, chatting easily about the upcoming party, completely unaware that she'd said anything at all remarkable, and I smiled and nodded and answered her questions about serving sizes, and the whole time some part of me was thinking, she doesn't even know what she revealed just now. That night I didn't say anything to anyone. I've never been a woman who makes scenes, and I wasn't about to start over a phone call I wasn't even supposed to hear. But I went up to my suite, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, and I thought about my husband, gone 8 years now, and what he would have said if he'd heard his wife described that way in her own son's house. He was a quiet man, but he wasn't a passive one, and I think for the first time since he'd died, I understood the difference between those two things clearly enough to feel ashamed that I'd let myself blur them together. I opened the little fireproof box that night, the one holding what remained of my savings and, more importantly, a folded document I hadn't looked at closely in over 2 years. The deed to the house I'd grown up calling home, the one I'd shared with my husband for 31 years. I want to explain something important here, something the family didn't fully understand, or perhaps chose not to remember clearly. When I sold that house, I didn't put all the proceeds into cash. On the advice of an old friend who'd become a financial planner, I'd used a good portion of it to purchase a small rental property outright, a modest but solid 2-bedroom home across town, deeded entirely in my name, generating a steady monthly rental income that nobody in that house knew existed. To them, I was a woman with a small pension and not much else, dependent, grateful, essentially theirs to direct. In truth, I had quietly built myself a floor to stand on, and I had never told a soul in that household about it, because some part of me, some old instinct, had whispered that a day might come when I would need something the family didn't know I had. I don't say this to boast. I say this because it matters for what comes later. A woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated learns, sometimes without even realizing she's learning it, to keep a little something in reserve. Around this same time, the topic of David's boss started coming up more and more at the dinner table. A man named Gary Whitfield, regional vice president at David's company, someone David was eager to impress, someone whose good opinion, Rachel made clear more than once, could mean a real promotion for David within the year. Rachel began planning a dinner, not a casual family dinner, a dinner with intention, the kind engineered down to the napkin folds. Have you ever watched a household transform itself for the sake of someone else's approval? The good china came down from a cabinet I hadn't seen opened in the entire time I'd lived there. Rachel bought a new dress, and I noticed, because I notice things, the little blue box it came in, the kind that isn't cheap. She had her hair done. She ordered flowers, actual cut flowers delivered to the house, when normally the grocery store bouquet did just fine for every other occasion of the year. This dinner mattered to her in a way that made me uneasy, though I couldn't yet say exactly why. What Rachel did not do in all that planning was ask me to be a guest at that dinner. She asked me to cook it. I want to sit with you in that particular sting for a moment, because I think some of you already know exactly the feeling I mean. It is one thing to be overworked, It is another thing entirely to be overworked and then quietly excluded from the reward of the evening you built with your own 2 hands. I was to prepare a beef tenderloin, a full spread of sides, a homemade dessert, and then once the doorbell rang and the guests arrived, I understood without being told directly that I was expected to remain largely in the kitchen. Not hidden exactly, just positioned, available if something was needed. Not seated at the table as David's mother among David's boss and Rachel's parents, who were also invited. Simply useful. If any part of you has ever felt this exact shape of exclusion, being essential to an event but erased from its guest list, I want you to know I see you, truly, and if you haven't hit like on this video yet, would you consider doing that now? It costs nothing, and it tells me these stories are reaching the people who need them. Thank you. Now let me tell you about the days right before that dinner because the pressure kept climbing and I want you to feel exactly how it climbed. The week of the dinner, Rachel's request came faster and sharper. Can you make sure the tenderloin isn't overdone this time? Meaning the one time months earlier I'd cooked a roast slightly past medium and she'd mentioned it twice since, as though it were a defining flaw in my character rather than 4 extra minutes in an oven. Can you iron the tablecloth, the good one, not the everyday one? Can you make sure the kids are fed and upstairs by 6:30 so they're not underfoot? Can you, could you, would you, over and over, until the request blurred into a single continuous hum I could hear even when the house was silent. David, to his credit in this narrow moment, did offer to help me with the grocery shopping that Thursday, and I appreciated it. I want to be fair about that. Because fairness matters to me even now, even after everything. But when we were in the car together, just the two of us, I tried gently to bring up how tired I'd been feeling. I said something like, David, it's a lot some weeks, the house, the kids, now this dinner too. And my son, my only child, looked genuinely surprised and said, Mom, I thought you liked staying busy. You always say idle hands make you crazy. He wasn't being cruel. He was being blind, which in some ways is a harder thing to forgive because cruelty at least sees you enough to choose to hurt you. Blindness simply doesn't see you at all. I let it go. I always let it go up until that point in my life. Because I'd been raised to believe that a mother's love shouldn't come with conditions or complaints attached, and some deep old part of me still believed that, even as another part of me, a newer part, a part that had been quietly waking up for months, was starting to whisper that love without any boundary at all isn't really love, it's just a slow erosion dressed up in a nicer word. That night, after David had gone up to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I thought about my own mother, who used to say that a woman's worth in a family gets tested not in the good years, but in the years she becomes inconvenient. I hadn't understood that saying. As a young woman, I understood it now, sitting in a kitchen that wasn't mine, in a house I'd helped pay for in ways nobody in that house fully appreciated, feeling something between grief and clarity settle over me like a blanket that was both heavy and, strangely, comforting. The tablecloth for the dinner sat folded on the counter, waiting for its ironing, the good one, the cream-colored linen with the small embroidered corners that had belonged to Rachel's grandmother. I ran my fingers over that embroidery that night, thinking about how many hands had touched this cloth before mine, how many women across, how many generations had ironed it, folded it, set a table with it, largely unthanked, largely unseen, and how strange it was that the work of care moves invisibly through families like water through soil, everyone drinking from it, almost no one asking where it comes from. I want to tell you something else about that week, something small, but that stayed with me. Tyler, my grandson, only 5 at the time, came into the kitchen one evening while I was scrubbing the good silver for the dinner, and he climbed up onto a stool beside me and asked if he could help. I gave him a soft cloth and a spoon that didn't need much polishing, and we sat there together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and he said out of nowhere, the way children do, Grandma, "You work more than Mommy and Daddy combined." I laughed, a little sadly, and told him that grandmas just have a different kind of job, and he nodded seriously, the way 5-year-olds nod when they've decided something is true and important, and went back to his spoon. Children see more than we credit them for. They simply don't yet have the words to challenge what they see. 2 nights before the dinner, something happened that I think of now as the true turning point, even more than the comment itself, because it's what prepared the ground for everything after. I was up late finishing the ironing Rachel had asked for, and I walked past the home office to get more starch from the hall closet, and the door was cracked open, and I heard Rachel on the phone again, this time with her mother. She was talking about the dinner, about impressing Gary, about the promotion timeline for David, and then she said something that stopped me cold in the hallway. She said, and once David gets that promotion, honestly, we should think about whether we still need Eleanor living here full-time. Maybe a smaller arrangement somewhere. It would free up the guest suite for a home gym, finally. I stood there in the dark hallway with a can of spray starch in my hand, and I understood, in one long silent breath, that I was not being folded into this family's life. I was being used until my usefulness ran its course, and then I was to be relocated like furniture that no longer suited the room. A smaller arrangement. That's what she called it. Not my home, not my safety. A smaller arrangement to free up space for a home gym. I went back to my ironing that night, and I finished every last piece on that board because that's who I am. I finish what's in front of me, even when my hands are shaking slightly with something I couldn't yet name. But something inside me had shifted permanently. I no longer needed proof that I was seen as disposable. I had heard it plainly, in her own voice, unguarded, honest, in the particular way people are only honest when they think no one's listening. I didn't sleep well that night, and I want to describe what that felt like honestly, because I think some of you know this particular kind of sleeplessness. It isn't the tossing and turning of worry exactly. It's more like lying very still in the dark, staring at a ceiling you didn't choose, in a room that technically belongs to someone else's garage, running a single sentence through your mind on a loop, a smaller arrangement until the words start to lose their normal shape and become almost meaningless, the way any word does if you repeat it enough times. And yet somehow, the sting of it never dulled, no matter how many times it circled back around. At some point past midnight, I got up and stood at the small window of my suite, looking down at the driveway, at David's silver car catching a bit of moonlight, at the dark shape of the house that used to be mine sold now to strangers I'd never met, somewhere across town, sleeping soundly in rooms that used to hold my own furniture, my own life. I thought about how strange it is that a house can hold so much of a person's history and then simply belong to someone else the next day. Walls that don't remember you, floors that forget your footsteps within a season. I wondered, standing there, whether I was about to lose this place too, this garage suite that wasn't even really mine, whether the ground beneath me had ever actually been solid, or whether I'd simply been standing very carefully on something that was always going to give way eventually. But somewhere in that same sleepless hour, another feeling arrived alongside the fear. Quieter, sturdier, something that felt almost like the calm before Ohio thunderstorms in summer, that particular stillness in the air right before the sky does what it's going to do regardless of anyone's preference. I had a rental property with my name alone on the deed. I had savings. I had, more than anything, 60 years of practice absorbing hard things and still getting up the next morning to do what needed doing. Whatever was coming, I was not in fact a woman without resources. I was simply a woman who had not yet used them. The day of the dinner arrived, bright and unbearably ordinary, the kind of day that gives no warning for what it's about to hold. I was up at 6 that morning. By 10 I had the tenderloin seasoned and resting. By noon I'd made a chocolate torte from scratch, the same recipe my own mother taught me 60 years ago, and I remember standing at that counter thinking of her, wondering what she would say if she could see her daughter at 71 years old, baking a torte for a party she wasn't invited to sit at. Rachel's parents arrived first, pleasant enough people, a little stiff, clearly primed for the importance of the evening. Then came Gary Whitfield and his wife, and I want to describe this man honestly. He wasn't a villain in this story. He was simply a successful man in an expensive watch who had no idea he was about to become the accidental witness to something that had been building in that house for 2 years. Introductions happened in the living room. I heard them from the kitchen, the particular music of ice clinking in good glasses, and Rachel's bright performing laugh, the laugh she used for people she wanted something from. I served the appetizers myself, smiled, said hello, retreated back to the kitchen exactly as expected. Nobody asked me to sit. David caught my eye once across the room and gave me a small, apologetic smile, the kind of smile that acknowledges a wrong without doing anything to fix it, and honestly, in that moment, that half smile hurt nearly as much as everything else, because it told me he knew. On some level, my son knew exactly what was happening to me in his own home, and he was choosing comfort over correction. I want to pause here and ask you directly, have you ever been the one holding a household together while being quietly written out of its story? If you're nodding right now, even just to yourself, I want you to know this story is for you. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like mine waiting here, and each one is a reminder that we are not as alone as these families sometimes make us feel. Now let me take you into that kitchen. At the exact moment everything changed. Dinner service went smoothly at first. I plated the tenderloin exactly the way I'd practiced, garnished the potatoes with the fresh chives I'd grown myself in a little pot on the guest suite windowsill, brought each course out with the kind of care I'd bring to serving my own husband on our anniversary, because that's simply who I am. I don't do anything halfway, not even the things that go unnoticed. I refilled water glasses, I cleared the appetizer plates. I smiled at Gary's wife when she complimented the greens. And then, as the main course was being enjoyed and I stepped back into the kitchen to plate the dessert, the door didn't fully close behind me, and I heard everything. Gary was asking Rachel something about how she managed it all, the career, the kids, the house. Clearly meaning it as a compliment, the kind of easy small talk successful men make at dinner parties. And Rachel laughed that bright performing laugh again and said, "Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without help." And then, and I will remember this sentence until the day I die, she said, "At least our maid is good for something." I was standing at that counter with a torte in my hands, my fingers still faintly stained from the cocoa, my hip aching from 12 hours on my feet, and the room around me seemed to go very silent, even though I could still hear the party continuing on the other side of that door. Glasses clinking, someone laughing at something else entirely, life simply moving forward. Unaware that a woman on the other side of a swinging door had just been erased from her own family in front of a stranger. I didn't drop the torte, I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think sometimes we imagine these moments should come with some dramatic outward reaction, shattering plates, raised voices, but that isn't how dignity works. Not real dignity, the kind that's been tested for years and has learned its own strength. I simply stood there, very still, feeling that hairline fracture from months earlier finally, quietly, complete itself into something whole and undeniable. Our maid, not my mother-in-law, not David's mom, not even simply Eleanor. Our maid, spoken to a man she barely knew, spoken in my son's own house, spoken about the woman who had sold her home, who had raised the very child sitting at that table, who had cooked every dish being praised at that moment on that table. Something in me that had been bending for 2 straight years, quietly, patiently, hopefully, finally reached the absolute limit of how far it could bend without breaking entirely, and instead of breaking, it simply straightened. I finished plating that dessert. My hands were perfectly steady, which surprised even me. I carried it out myself, set it in the center of the table with a small, genuine smile, said something pleasant about the recipe being my late mother's, accepted the compliments graciously, and then told the room I was feeling a bit tired and would head up early, thanking them all for a lovely evening. Rachel barely looked up. David said, "Get some rest, Mom. Love you." And I said it back. Because I did. I do. Love does not simply vanish because it's been taken for granted. I walked up those stairs to my suite above the garage with more clarity in my chest than I'd felt in 2 years. I sat down on the edge of my bed, and I did not cry, though I want you to know it would have been perfectly fine if I had. Instead, I opened that little fireproof box one more time, and I began to make a plan. If you've ever had a moment like that, the moment where hurt turns into decision, where you stop absorbing and start acting, I want to hear about it in the comments, truly, because these stories connect us in ways that matter. And if this video has been worth your time so far, a share with someone who might need it means more than any algorithm ever could. Now, let me tell you what I did next, because this is where everything begins to turn. I did not confront Rachel that night, and I want to explain why, because I think it's important. Confrontation in anger gives the other person something to push back against, an emotional moment they can later frame as an overreaction, a misunderstanding. Poor old Eleanor got upset over nothing. I had learned, over 71 years of living, that the women who win these quiet wars are the ones who plan before they speak, not the ones who speak before they plan. So instead of confronting anyone, I made a phone call the following Monday morning, while the house was empty and quiet, to a woman named Patricia Coleman, an attorney a friend from my old book club had used years earlier for her own estate matters, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s with an office downtown and absolutely no patience for nonsense of any kind. I sat across from Patricia's desk that Monday afternoon, and I told her everything. Not with tears, not even really with much anger yet. Just facts laid out plainly, the way I'd laid out insurance claims for 26 years. The house I'd sold, the rental property still deeded solely in my name, the savings, the unpaid labor, the comment. Patricia listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, she said something I've held on to ever since. She said, "Eleanor, you haven't lost anything here except your patience, and honestly, you're entitled to lose that. Legally, you are in a stronger position than you seem to realize." Patricia explained several things to me clearly that day. First, that the rental property was entirely mine, untouched by anything happening in David and Rachel's household, generating over $1,400 a month that had simply been accumulating quietly in a separate account. Second, that nothing in writing anywhere obligated me to provide free domestic labor to my son's household, and that if I wished, I had every legal right to simply stop, effective immediately, without needing anyone's permission. And third, something I hadn't even fully considered, that given my age and the physical demands being placed on me, there existed clear documentation now, through Patricia's own notes and a formal evaluation she recommended I get, of my complete mental competency and sound decision-making should anyone in the future ever attempt to suggest otherwise, which, given what I'd overheard about power of attorney conversations at other family gatherings months earlier, Patricia felt was worth protecting against preemptively. That second point mattered more than I initially realized. A few months before, at a family barbecue, I'd overheard Rachel's father mention almost casually that it might be wise for the family to look into power of attorney paperwork for me soon, just in case, for peace of mind, he'd said. At the time, I'd brushed it off as ordinary caution. Now, sitting in Patricia's office, I understood it differently. A woman who does everything for free and is called the maid in her own household is a woman whose independence someone might eventually find convenient to quietly dissolve. Patricia scheduled the competency evaluation for me the following week. A formality, really, a full afternoon with a geriatric psychiatrist who asked me questions about memory, reasoning, current events, financial judgment, and at the end of it told me with something like amusement that my cognitive function was, in his exact words, sharper than most of his patients 30 years younger. I laughed for the first time in what felt like months when he said that. Over the following 2 weeks, while continuing to live in that house exactly as before, cooking, cleaning, picking up the children, giving no outward sign that anything had shifted, I quietly built my floor beneath me even sturdier. Patricia helped me formalize a simple document confirming the rental property's sole ownership, confirming my competency, and, at my request, drafting a clear written record of the informal financial contributions I'd been making, groceries, utility overages, the occasional larger expense I'd covered without ever mentioning it, totaling, when we added it all up, just over $11,000 over 2 years. $11,000 I had given freely out of love, never once asking for a receipt or a thank you, and never once until that dinner, regretting it. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever discovered that your own quiet generosity had been not just unnoticed but actively taken for granted, treated as an obligation rather than a gift? If that resonates, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps other women find their way to this channel when they need it most. Thank you for being here with me. Now let me tell you about the night everything came fully into the light. 6 weeks after that first dinner, Rachel decided to host another one. this time for her own parents, and notably for David's grandmother on his father's side, 90 years old and sharp as a tack, a woman named Vivian, who I'd always adored and who, I would later learn, had never particularly cared for the way Rachel spoke to me either. The occasion was David's official announcement of his promotion, the one Gary Whitfield had ultimately approved, and Rachel wanted, once again, to make an impression, a celebration dinner to mark the family's rising fortunes. I agreed to help with this dinner too, and some of you might wonder why, after everything. I want to explain that. I wasn't doing it out of the old obligation anymore. I was doing it because I had a plan, and this dinner was going to be the stage for it. And also, honestly, because I still loved my son, and I still, in some complicated way, wanted to see him celebrated properly, even if celebrating properly meant finally correcting the record about who I actually was in that house. 2 days before the dinner, Rachel approached me in the kitchen. And I want you to understand the audacity of what came next, because even now it takes my breath away slightly to recount it. She had a folder in her hand, and inside it was a document, a power of attorney form, and beside it a second document, a quitclaim deed. Prepared? She explained gently, almost sweetly, in that tone people use when they think they're being generous, to simplify things for the family, to make sure that if anything ever happened to me, everything would transfer smoothly, no complications, no probate headaches. She called it just being practical, just protecting me from complications I was too tired, too busy, too old, in her unspoken assumption, to want to deal with myself. The quitclaim deed for the rental property, the one asset in this entire story that had never belonged to anyone but me, that they didn't even fully understand the value of, being asked casually over a cutting board of diced onions to simply sign away. I looked at that folder for a long moment, and I felt something settle inside me, not rage exactly, something calmer and colder, and far more useful than rage. I told Rachel, in a perfectly pleasant voice, that I'd like my own attorney to review anything before I signed it, just to be thorough, and I watched her face flicker, just slightly, with something between surprise and irritation, quickly smoothed back over into that bright social smile. "Of course," she said, "of course, no rush at all, Eleanor." There was no rush from my side either. Patricia had already reviewed the concept months earlier in theory and confirmed exactly what I suspected, that there was no legitimate reason for me to sign away sole ownership of an asset that had nothing to do with anyone's estate planning except potentially my own, on my own terms, decided by me alone. But I let Rachel believe I was simply being cautious, an old woman being appropriately careful, because I wanted the real conversation to happen where it belonged, in front of the whole family at that dinner, the same stage where I'd been so casually erased weeks before. The night of the second dinner arrived. I cooked again, yes, but this time I also dressed for the evening, a soft blue dress I hadn't worn in over a year, my hair done properly, and when David's grandmother Vivian arrived and found me still in the kitchen instead of seated at the table, she said in front of everyone, in that clear, unbothered voice only very old women seem to have fully earned the right to use, "Eleanor, why on earth are you back there? Come sit down, you're not the help." I could have kissed her. I did join the table for that first course, at Vivian's insistence, and I watched Rachel's composure flicker again, just slightly, at the shift in the room's dynamic. Conversation moved along, pleasantly enough. David's promotion was toasted. Gary Whitfield wasn't present this time. It was a smaller, more family-focused gathering, but the weight in the room had changed, and I think everyone felt it a little, even if they couldn't name why. It was Rachel herself, near the end of the meal, who brought up the paperwork, perhaps trying to resolve it quickly, cleanly in front of family, assuming, I believe, that social pressure would work in her favor, that I wouldn't want to make a scene in front of Vivian and her own parents. She said lightly, "Eleanor, did you get a chance to look over those forms? We'd love to get that squared away before things get busy again." And this is the moment, the one I'd been quietly preparing for. I set down my fork and I spoke calmly, clearly, without a single raised note in my voice, because I didn't need volume, I needed only truth. I told the table that I had in fact had the documents reviewed by my own attorney and that I would not be signing a quitclaim deed on the rental property, because that property, purchased entirely with my own funds from the sale of my family home, had never belonged to this household, and never would, unless I personally chose otherwise. Which, I said, looking directly at Rachel, I currently had no intention of doing. I watched David's face shift from confusion to a kind of dawning understanding. "A rental property, Mom," he said quietly. "You have a rental property?" And I told him yes, I did, and had for 2 years, generating income I'd simply kept private, the way any adult is entitled to keep their own financial matters private, and that I also had, should anyone need it, a full written record of the $11,000 I'd personally contributed to this household's groceries and expenses over that same period. Freely given, never once mentioned, until apparently someone in this house had decided I was worth mentioning only as the help. The table went very quiet. Rachel's mother looked at her plate. Vivian, I noticed, was smiling faintly into her wine glass, the smile of a woman watching a long overdue correction finally arrive. And then I said the sentence I'd been holding inside me for 6 weeks, the one I'd rehearsed alone in my room more times than I'll admit. I said, "I heard what you told Gary Whitfield's wife at the last dinner, Rachel. I heard you call me the maid, and I want you all to know I am not and have never been anyone's maid in this house. I am David's mother. I am Sophie and Tyler's grandmother. And everything I have done in this home, I have done out of love, freely given, which means it can also, quite freely, be withdrawn. If you've ever waited for the right moment to speak your own truth calmly, without shouting, without breaking, I hope this part of my story gives you something to hold on to. And if it has, please consider commenting one word below: dignity, so I know this part reached you the way I hope it does. Let's finish this story together. The days following that dinner were quiet in a different way than the quiet I'd known for 2 years. Not the quiet of being unseen, but the quiet of a household recalibrating itself around a truth that could no longer be ignored. Rachel didn't apologize that night, and honestly I hadn't expected her to. Some people need distance and time before pride allows for anything close to accountability, and I'd stopped needing her apology to validate what I already knew about my own worth. David came to my suite 2 nights later, sat on the edge of my bed the way he used to when he was small and couldn't sleep. And he apologized, really apologized, for the first time in 2 years. He said he hadn't seen it, or maybe he had seen it and told himself it was fine, because acknowledging it would have meant confronting his wife, and confronting his wife felt harder than simply letting his mother absorb the weight quietly. I appreciated the honesty of that admission more than I can easily explain. It's a rare thing, a grown man admitting his own passivity out loud, without excuses wrapped around it. He asked me that night, quietly, almost like a much younger version of himself, whether I was going to leave, whether I was planning to move out and take an apartment somewhere with the rental income I'd revealed. And I told him the truth, that I hadn't decided yet, that some part of me wanted to stay close to Sophie and Tyler more than anything else in the world, but that staying would have to look different now, and that the choice of whether it could look different was entirely his family's to make, not mine to force. He nodded, and for a long moment neither of us said anything, and it was the first comfortable silence we'd shared in that house in over a year. I thought a great deal in those weeks about what I actually wanted, separate from what I'd simply fallen into out of habit and hurt feelings and the fear of being a burden. I realized I didn't want to leave, not really, not yet. I loved hearing Tyler's feet pounding down the hallway in the mornings. I loved braiding Sophie's hair and hearing about her day in that breathless run-on way children have of telling you everything and nothing at once. What I wanted wasn't distance from this family. What I wanted was simply to matter inside it as a person, and not only as a function, to be Grandma Eleanor at that table, not a fixture of the household that happened to also share their last name by marriage of blood. I made some decisions in the weeks that followed, practical ones, concrete ones, not speeches, not ultimatums, just changes. I used my own money from the rental income I'd been quietly saving to hire back a cleaning service twice a week, the same rate Carmen used to receive, and I made it clear this wasn't a gift to the household. it was simply what should have existed all along, and that I would no longer be doing that labor myself, not out of spite, but out of basic fairness to my own body at 71 years old. I still cook some nights because I genuinely love cooking, and because Sophie and Tyler light up when Grandma makes her chicken and dumplings. But I cook now because I choose to, 2 or 3 nights a week, not because an unspoken expectation demands it of me every single day. I set a boundary with Rachel too, calm and clear, delivered once without repetition or negotiation. I told her I would always be respectful in her home, and I expected the same in return, and that any comment made about me to my face or otherwise would from that point forward be addressed directly and honestly the same day, not absorbed silently the way I'd absorbed things for 2 years. Rachel and I are not close now, I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. We are civil, we are polite. She has, to her credit, not made another comment like that one since, and I believe some part of her did understand eventually what she'd revealed about herself that night, even if she's never said so aloud. With David, things healed more genuinely. He checks in with me now, in a way he didn't before, asks how my hip is doing, notices when I look tired, tells Sophie and Tyler, directly in front of me, that Grandma isn't the housekeeper. Grandma is family, and family helps each other, which means everyone helps, not just Grandma. Small words, but I felt every one of them land somewhere old and tender in me that had been waiting 2 years to hear it. The house looks different now, in small ways that matter more than they'd seem to from the outside. There's a chore chart on the refrigerator, Sophie and Tyler's idea actually. Once they understood, in simple terms, their father explained to them that everyone in a family pitches in and nobody is anybody's servant. There's a standing Sunday dinner now where I sit at the table from the very first course to the last. No exceptions, a rule David set himself and has kept without fail. The cleaning service comes Tuesdays and Fridays, paid for by me, and I've made peace with that arrangement because it isn't charity, it's simply a woman spending her own money on her own comfort and her own home, the same as anyone else would. I visit my rental property sometimes now, just to check on my tenants, a young couple expecting their first baby, and I stand in that little 2-bedroom house that's entirely mine, deed and all, and I feel something I don't think I'd ever quite let myself feel before, which is a plain, uncomplicated pride in my own capability. 60 years of careful saving, careful choices, quiet foresight nobody around me fully understood or valued at the time, and it turned out to be exactly what steadied me when I needed steadying most. Vivian, David's grandmother, calls me every couple of weeks now, and we talk for an hour sometimes about nothing in particular, and at the end of every call she tells me the same thing in that same clear, unbothered voice. Good for you, Eleanor. Good for you. And something in me still warms every single time she says it, an old woman being told by an even older woman that she did right by herself. Finally, after 2 long years of doing right by everyone else first. I want to speak directly to you now, whoever you are, listening to this at whatever hour you found this video. If you have given your whole self to a family, a job, a marriage, anything, and found yourself quietly renamed by your own usefulness, called the help, the maid, the free labor, instead of being called what you actually are, I want you to hear this clearly. Being needed is not the same thing as being valued. And a family that only sees you through what you provide for them has not yet learned to see you at all. I was not placed in that house to serve. I was its foundation, holding up walls nobody else even noticed needed holding. And on the day I stopped being invisible, I discovered something I wish I'd known decades earlier, that I never needed to be anyone's maid to have worth. I had it all along, quietly, in my own 2 capable hands. Thank you for spending this time with me and letting me tell you my story tonight. If it moved something in you, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it too. There are more stories like mine here waiting for you whenever you need them. Take care of yourself and I'll see you in the next one.